All right, gang, Mr. Spencer here. We've been talking a lot about how we set up different scientific experiments. And what I want to dive a little more deeply into today is figuring out how do we write that procedure? How do we set up the directions on how to do this experiment so that if somebody else were to look at what we've written, they could do the exact same thing that we've been working on. Now, as I've taught this in the past, I've found that it helps to have a little bit of structure to things. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some different, we'll call them sections for writing procedures in our science classes. So the first section is going to be, we're going to describe how we set up the experiment. The second section, we're going to talk about the steps of how we're going to test this first increment of the independent variable. And then the third section is just nice and easy of repeat steps, blank through blank with whatever. We'll talk more about this here in a little bit. But let's do this. I want you to think back to the very first experiment that we did. All right. Now, back then, it was called Which Ball is the Bounciest? And we've since kind of talked about the issues with that. And we've reframed that to say, rather than which ball is the bounciest, it's which type of ball bounces the highest. So think about what we've talked about with this. And if we were talking, or if we were looking at this scientific question, well, what would be the independent variable here? Okay, what are the two things that we're comparing? What would be and if we have the independent variable, what's going to be the dependent variable? What will be some things that need to stay constant? What kind of materials are we going to need? So once again, thinking back to what we've talked about, we know that the independent variable is the thing that we are adjusting. So in this question, which type of ball bounces the highest? Well, we're in charge of picking the type of ball. Now, when we change the type of ball, we want to see what that affects. So in this case, the thing that we're looking at to see if it changes is how high that ball bounces. So if I want to see the cause and effect here of changing the type of ball and how high it bounces, I need to make sure that everything else stays the same. So those constants, it might be something like we want to make sure that when we change the type of ball that they're all dropped from the same height, or they're all dropped onto the same surface, or we're all measuring from the same point. Stuff like that, so that we know that any change in the type of ball, any change in how high the ball bounces, how that relates to the type of ball. Now, let's go and let's think about how we would set up this experiment. Now, when I look at this, or when I do this, I want to kind of do a drawing. And you guys know me already. I'm not that great of an artist, and that's just kind of how it is. But you want to sketch something out so that people can kind of take a look at it and see what it is that they're supposed to do. Also, it kind of shows that you know what's going on. But if I was to sketch of how this experiment would look like, if I'm trying to figure out which type of ball bounces the highest, well, I'm going to have my meter stick right over here, and here's the ground. Okay, and I'm going to take this ball, and I'm going to drop it from a certain height, and it's going to bounce up to a certain height. Well, I just want to be able to show people who are trying to replicate this what it looks like. Yours might look a little bit different, but the idea is there. Now, let's start thinking of how we're going to set up these steps. Remember, I want to write out these steps in the experiment so someone else that's never seen this before could follow them exactly. So here's what I like to see happen in class. The very first section, we're describing the initial setup. I want to explain to the people who are reading this how you're going to set up the experiment before we do anything else. So if I was thinking about which type of ball bounces the highest, I'm going to set it up by, let's say, I'm going to get the tennis ball, the racquetball, the golf ball, the meter stick, just kind of the stuff that we need to do here. And then I'm going to take that meter stick. And I want to be very specific about this. I want to say, okay, we're going to take that meter stick and we're going to put it vertically, so up and down against the wall. And I want to make sure they know how to set this up. So we're going to be specific and say, okay, I want the 0 centimeter end of that meter stick, it's going to be on the floor. All right? And that's pretty much how we're going to set this up. The second part is we want to take that independent variable, which in this case is the type of ball, and we want to explain how we're going to set that up to test the very first one. So let's say we have a tennis ball. Well, now that I've set up our meter stick, I want to hold the tennis ball so that the bottom of the ball is at the top of the meter stick. So that's going to be 100 centimeters. I'm then going to drop it so that it falls straight down towards the floor. And I want to record how high the bottom of the ball reaches at its tallest point, or when it bounces back up, how high does the bottom of the ball get. Also, I want to do this thing that's called multiple trials. We need to make sure that we test each of these independent variable increments, in this case, the type of ball. We want to test them multiple times. 3 is kind of the magic number, and that helps so that we can find an average and just make sure that all our data is reliable. But this section here is showing us how we're going to go through the experiment with the first two. That's kind of how everything goes. After this point, we're at section 3. The only thing we're changing is the type of ball. So rather than going through and rewriting every single step of this, I'm just going to say, okay, now let's repeat steps 1 through 6 with the racquetball. Let's repeat steps 1 through 6 with the golf ball. And then at the end, we're going to take all those results. We're going to determine which type of ball bounces the highest. So that is kind of an example of how I want you to go through and write the step-by-step procedure for our experiments. Remember, the most important thing is that we want to make sure that someone else could go and follow those directions and do the exact same thing as we did. All right, I hope that helps. If you have any questions, just be sure to ask.